It's a small notch, 10 by 10 miles at its widest, but shortened by the weaving path of the Potomac River that it sits beside. Carved out of Maryland and nestled between it and Virginia, the District of Columbia is not a part of any state. Yet within this small chunk of the United States, a piece of land that could fit inside Rhode Island 17 times over, live nearly 700,000 people, more than the entire populations of Vermont or Wyoming. Even more commute into the city from the suburbs in Maryland and Virginia, and this small federal district is the anchor and urban core of the ninth most populous urban area in the entire United States, a metropolis of 4.5 million. On top of that all, it's held the status of being the U.S. capital for the last 232 years, housing every president except its namesake, Washington. The 61 square miles that make up the federal district is easily one of the most influential places on Earth. The history of the country has been shaped inside its halls and buildings, and on its streets and parks, and from this tiny district, decisions have been made that impacted people across the globe. I've had the privilege to live in the district for a few months, and I can say with confidence that it's one of my favorite places in the world. DC is a truly incredible city, and the 14th place I will cover in the US Explained, a 56-part series on every state, territory, and federal district in the country, by order of admission. Hello and welcome to That Is Interesting. I'm your host, Carter. This is the US Explained, Episode 14, The District of Columbia. DC sits fully in the humid subtropical climate zone, with hot summers, mild winters, and humidity. DC itself is a nickname, the abbreviation for the District of Columbia, and people also call it the District. Its name can be confusing for a number of reasons. First off, there is another Washington, the state in the Pacific Northwest. And because of that, people will call the state Washington State and the district Washington, D.C. But what's the reason for its two names, Washington and the District of Columbia? The answer is actually pretty simple. When you're specifying where you live, you might say both the city and the state, for example, Detroit, Michigan, or Dallas, Texas. The District of Columbia, or DC for short, is similar in this case to a state, whereas Washington is a city located within it. It's confusing because Washington is the only city in the district and its borders are one and the same with it. They are by all means the exact same thing. It wasn't always that way though. When the district was first carved out, much of it was rural and part of it was located in what is now Virginia. It was home to 3 different cities, which were separate and distinct, Washington, Georgetown, and Alexandria, and 2 rural counties, Washington County and Alexandria County. The portions south of the Potomac were later ceded back to Virginia, and eventually the sections north of the Potomac had grown into a single urbanized mass, making the different cities and counties obsolete, and they were all merged into one entity, making Washington and the District of Columbia one and the same. The name Washington comes from the first U.S. president, George Washington, who chose the location that the district would be established. His name actually comes from a small town in England named Washington, now a suburb of Newcastle, where his family originated. Columbia is a name taken from Christopher Columbus that's been used historically to refer to the United States and the Americas overall, like the term America, but it was more common in the past. Both Washington and Columbia are place names that are common throughout the United States. In fact, Washington is the most common city name in the country, and the U.S. capital is the largest of 88 different American cities with the name. DC has, in my opinion, one of the best flags in the country. It consists of a white background with 2 red stripes and 3 red stars on top, and it's based off the Washington family coat of arms. It's a simple and memorable design that looks completely different from most state flags in the U.S. People in the district love their flag, and you see it all the time flying throughout the city and on license plates, bumper stickers, shirts, logos, and other designs. It's all around a really great flag and a major point of pride with Washingtonians. DC is the smallest subdivision of the entire United States. It takes up less land than every state and every territory in the country, with a land area of just 61 square miles or 158 square kilometers. a little bit smaller than Liechtenstein. In terms of population, it ranks number 50 out of the 56 states, territories, and districts in the country, home to 689,545 people. While it's certainly on the low end, that's still more people than live in every U.S. territory other than Puerto Rico and 2 states, Vermont and Wyoming. The highly urbanized nature of the district, with so many people packed in such a small space, gives it far and away the highest population density of any of the country's 56 subdivisions, packing 11,295 people in the average DC square mile, or 4,361 per square kilometer. Just for comparison, the subdivision with the second highest population density and the state with the highest is New Jersey, with 1,263 people per square mile. This gives DC a population density nearly 9 times higher than the next most densely populated place I cover in this series. Just for comparison, only 2 countries, the city-states of Monaco and Singapore, have a higher population density than the District of Columbia. Washington, D.C. has pretty simple borders. It sits between 2 states, Maryland and Virginia, and its suburbs stretch deep into each. Because the actual land within the district is so small, despite being the core of the urban area, the D.C. suburbs in Maryland and Northern Virginia are both more populous than the district itself, with millions of people living outside the district in suburban Maryland and Northern Virginia. Including these suburbs, the Washington, D.C. urban area is home to 4.5 million people, more than any other urban area in the country save for New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Miami, Philadelphia, Dallas, San Francisco, and Houston. The district used to be a square rotated into a diamond shape with corners on the north, south, east, and westernmost points, and all 4 sides 10 miles each. The Potomac weaved down the middle from northwest to southeast. In 1847, the Retrosession saw the part of D.C. south of the Potomac return to Virginia, giving it the unique shape it has today, bordering Maryland on 3 sides by land and Virginia to the southwest across the river. D.C. also owns most of the Potomac all the way up to the Virginia border, as well as all the islands within that part of the river. If you live in Arlington, for example, and wade out into the Potomac, in most places you will have entered D.C. The district is home to 2 main islands, Theodore Roosevelt Island, a forested island home to the Theodore Roosevelt Memorial, which is only accessible by a footbridge from Roslyn, Virginia, and a larger man-made island where the Jefferson Memorial is located, created from dredging and land reclamation around the river and Tidal Basin. The Potomac is the district's main river, but another river, the Anacostia, runs through it as well, mostly in the southeastern part of the district, starting in Maryland and meeting the Potomac in D.C. There's really only one other body of water to speak of in D.C., Rock Creek, in the northwestern part of the city, also flowing in from Maryland. It's surrounded for much of its length by Rock Creek Park, a massive park filled with forest and trails and home to the National Zoo, although a number of other creeks, such as Tiber Creek, have been buried and now flow under the city through tunnels. Downtown Washington, all the way from the Potomac to the Anacostia, is mostly flat. Beyond that, it's filled with low, rolling hills. Other than parks, the entire district is urbanized. The National Mall cuts east-west from the Lincoln Memorial beside the Potomac to the U.S. Capitol, where Congress meets, located on a small hill called Capitol Hill. The mall, a grassy, manicured park, is home to some of the most famous monuments and memorials in the United States, such as the Washington Monument, Vietnam War Memorial, and World War II Memorial. To the north of the Washington Monument sits the Ellipse, another park that the White House, the home of the president, sits at the north end of. To the south of the Washington Monument is the Tidal Basin, an enclosed body of water surrounded by parks, DC's famous cherry blossom trees, and monuments like the Martin Luther King Memorial, Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial, and Thomas Jefferson Memorial. Downtown D.C. sits to the north of the White House, and in general, the heart of the city, which most of the large office buildings and apartments sit in, stretches from Foggy Bottom, east of where Rock Creek meets the Potomac, to Capitol Hill. D.C. has many distinct neighborhoods, and I'll talk about some of them more later on, but because the district has such a different government structure from the U.S. states, I'll take you through that first. Each U.S. state runs like a miniature version of the federal government. Simply put, they have state legislatures, usually state senate and state house, though this can vary, that write legislation, and then the executive, a governor, who signs bills into law. Washington, D.C. is different. The district was carved out so the federal government would not be under the jurisdiction of any state, and so no state would have too much sway in the workings of the government simply due to their location. The U.S. is far from the only country who has built a planned capital or created a federal district for this reason. The Distrito Federal in Mexico is home to Mexico City. In Brazil, it's home to Brasilia. The Australian Capital Territory is home to Canberra. And Nigeria, Malaysia, India, Pakistan, Venezuela, Argentina, and Russia all have some sort of federal district, though many of them are administered quite differently to D.C. As the federal district, the federal government, namely the U.S. Congress, is in charge of governing Washington, D.C. Though the city had a variety of governments before, its current form of government came in 1973, when Congress passed the D.C. Home Rule Act, providing a local government for the district. Despite the city having its own government, Congress has full control over their decisions. They can veto any laws they pass laws for D.C., and disband the district's government if they want to. There are also a number of laws that the Home Rule Act bans Washington government from passing in the first place. DC's had a variety of governments before, usually with executives and legislators appointed by the president, though at times they had been popularly elected. Under the control of Congress, Washingtonians have been pushing for equal voting rights and representation on par with the rest of the country throughout the district's history, especially as DC has grown to become a major city in its own right and surpassed several states in population. This movement, which currently takes the form of the district's push for statehood, has resulted in a number of major accomplishments. In the Home Rule Act, which has given DC's residents their most representative government they've had to date, is probably the most notable of them. Under the Home Rule Act, DC has a popularly elected mayor and a legislature called the Council of the District of Columbia, which has 13 members. The district is split into 8 wards, each home to around 86,000 people. Each ward elects 1 member to the council. An additional 4 members, as well as a council chairman, are elected at large by the entire district. DC also has 37 advisory neighborhood commissions, smaller neighborhood governments that advise the council on issues. DC's residents weren't allowed to vote in presidential elections until 1964. Since then, they've sent 3 members to the Electoral College each election cycle. DC also lacks voting representation in Congress. This, on top of residents not wanting Congress to be able to control their decision-making, is one of the main reasons most Washingtonians want statehood. A state consistent with their population would have 2 senators and 1 at-large representative to the House. In terms of congressional representation, DC is treated like a territory, and since 1970 has been able to send 1 delegate to the House of Representatives. Delegates are able to propose legislation, speak on the floor, and work in committees, but are unable to vote. DC's current and second delegate, Eleanor Holmes Norton, has served in that position for the last 31 years, representing the district. DC was originally home to 2 major groups of indigenous peoples, the Piscataway and the Nacotchtank, which were closely related. The Nacotchtank primarily inhabited the area, but with the arrival of European colonists in the Americas, they brought with them diseases that the indigenous people had not yet been exposed to, such as smallpox. These diseases ended up decimating the continent's indigenous peoples, killing 90% of them. Those that survived often died at the hands of colonists, as European settlements pushed further westward, encroaching on their land and pushing those that survived west. The Nacotchtank were largely wiped out, and those that survived joined with the Piscataway and were absorbed into their society. In 1606, Virginia, sitting across the river, received its colonial charter, and in the following decades, English colonists began settling and farming the region, and plantations growing crops like tobacco were common in the area around the Potomac. The province of Maryland was chartered in 1632, and all the land that's now part of D.C. belonged to it. A major river cutting inland from the Chesapeake Bay, the Potomac was an essential part of early colonial trade, and cities began developing alongside it, such as Alexandria in Virginia, and in 1751, Georgetown in Maryland. Georgetown quickly became an important city. It sat at an ideal location, the fall line of the Potomac. The elevation change from the flat coastal plains to the low foothills of the Appalachians or Appalachians caused a number of rapids and waterfalls along the Potomac in the area. The Little Falls, just north of Georgetown, made it the furthest point inland that ships could travel up the Potomac, turning it into an important port city, and Georgetown University was founded there. Other towns like the German community of Hamburg, where Foggy Bottom is today, and Carrollsburg at the confluence of the Potomac and Anacostia, developed as well. Following the Revolutionary War, the United States became independent, and on April 28, 1788, Maryland ratified the U.S. Constitution, becoming the 7th state to join the country. Georgetown and the area around it, though, would only be a part of the new state for 2 years. The search for the capital city had already begun. After determining that the United States should be joined together in a federal government, it was clear that the federal government would need a permanent capital city. The young country had already had 8 different capital cities, moving constantly between buildings and locations, with New York and Philadelphia holding the seat of government most frequently. In addition, many of the founders, such as James Madison, worried that were the capital to be located within a state, it would give the state too much power and influence over the federal government. The Constitution then gave Congress the power to carve out a 10-mile by 10-mile federal district to be the national capital and remain under their jurisdiction. The location was to be determined and quickly became a source of controversy between the North and South. Both the northern and southern states wanted the capital city located within their region. In addition, southern states, having mostly paid their war debts already, opposed a plan put forward by Alexander Hamilton that would have the federal government pay these debts for each of the states. The southern states agreed to support the debt plan if the capital city could be picked by George Washington and sit along the Potomac, a location that would place it in the south, but centrally located in the country and not far from the northern states either. This plan was signed into law on July 16, 1790, called the Residence Act. This is the date I used to place the District of Columbia into these series chronologically. I could have simply put it after all the states, but that wouldn't have made sense considering it's been in existence for well over 200 years. George Washington was a surveyor, and the strategic importance of the area around the falls was certainly not lost on him. In addition, it was an area he was very familiar with. His home, Mount Vernon, was just 6 miles downstream in Virginia. He basically chose his backyard. Washington was a planned city, and it needed a planner. George Washington chose Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, a French engineer and architect, to design the city. L'Enfant designed a city modeled after those of Europe, such as his hometown of Paris, with ornate, beautiful architecture, monuments, parks, and gardens, and a European-inspired system of streets unlike any other major city in the country, which I'll talk about more later. Even a canal called the Washington City Canal. It was initially square-shaped, home to land given by both Maryland and Virginia, though most of the city was developing on the side given by Maryland. Washington was a small city initially, still distinct from other cities in the district like Georgetown and Alexandria. In November of 1800, the White House and Capitol building were both completed, unfortunately both built by enslaved people. That same year, John Adams, the second president, became the first to reside in the executive mansion while Congress began meeting in the Capitol's chambers. Though only home to around 8,000 people, Washington, as the capital city, was coming together. Things changed though with the War of 1812. Britain, at war with France, had been violating U.S. maritime territory as well as kidnapping American merchants to serve on their ships. In response, the U.S. declared war on Britain and invaded British-controlled Canada. Though the war essentially ended in a draw, one of the worst moments for the young country came when British troops invaded Washington, D.C. in 1814. There, they burned down the Capitol, the White House, and other important buildings like the Library of Congress. The capital city was almost moved following its destruction, but Congress decided to stay and the city would slowly grow and rebuild. In 1828, construction began on the Chesapeake and Ohio, or Cno Canal, which aimed to cross the Appalachians, connecting the Potomac and Ohio rivers and linking Washington to Pittsburgh and the interior of the country. The project, however, was painstaking and took decades, having to follow the Potomac using locks due to the massive elevation changes along the river. By the time it made it to Cumberland, Maryland, over 20 years later, it had not yet reached the Ohio, and the Baltimore and Ohio, or B&O Railroad, had already beaten it west. For the next few decades, it would be a coal shipping route from the Appalachians to the Atlantic before falling into disrepair, though you can still see it and walk alongside it today. B&O rail lines made their way to D.C., though not long after. In the mid-1800s, tensions over slavery were rising fast. Washington was in many ways the center of this debate, as the national capital is where the disputes between anti- and pro-slavery politicians played out. On top of that, the city lay on the front lines of the divide between North and South. In the early decades of its existence, D.C. was undeniably a southern city. Maryland and even Delaware, both to the north of it, were also considered to be southern. But as divisions over slavery and eventually the Civil War they boiled into continued, things began to change. D.C. was the U.S. capital. The Union would obviously hold on to it at all costs. In addition, the most northern states of the South, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and West Virginia, a new state that broke off Virginia over its secession, were all known as border states, southern slave-owning states that chose to remain loyal to the Union. Its geography placed the city at a cultural crossroads between North and South, one that was epitomized by the Retrosession. The District of Columbia had initially been formed from land given by both Maryland and Virginia. Alexandria, formerly part of Virginia, was along with Washington and Georgetown one of the 3 cities that made up the District of Columbia. However, most of the district's development and growth had been centered on the other side of the Potomac in Washington and Georgetown, and economically, Alexandrians felt ignored. In addition, Alexandria wanted to keep slavery, which its economy was dependent on, legal, whereas many on the other side of the river wanted to abolish it in the district. For both these reasons, Alexandria began pushing to leave D.C. and return to Virginia, what was known as Retrosession. In 1846, Alexandria voted in favor of retrosession, and the Virginia legislature as well as Congress approved it, returning the part of D.C. southwest of the Potomac to Virginia and giving the district the shape and borders it has today. Because of this, when the Civil War broke out, the U.S. seat of government lay just across the river from the Confederacy, and their capital city, Richmond, was less than 100 miles away. Though fighting almost never came to D.C. itself, it had a major impact on the city and was rarely very far away. The city was rapidly fortified and developed during the war, and it ushered in major population growth as workers moved in to help build defenses, troops to protect it from invasion, and massive hospitals were constructed to help care for wounded Union troops from nearby battles. In addition, following the Emancipation Proclamation, many enslaved black people from throughout the South were freed by Union troops as the war progressed and fled north. D.C. was often the first major Union city they would come to, and as such, they added to an already large black population. Following the end of the war in 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in the city while watching a play at Ford's Theater, an event that shocked the nation and changed history. Just 16 years later, another president, James A. Garfield, was also assassinated in the city at a train station that stood where the National Gallery of Art is today. President Ulysses S. Grant made developing and improving the city a priority. During his presidency in the years that followed, as the city continued to grow in population, it also modernized, paving its roads, building streetcars, electric lights, filling in the now unsanitary Washington City Canal, constructing the towering Washington Monument, and passing the Organic Act of 1871, absorbing Georgetown and the rest of the district into Washington, turning it into a singular entity and giving D.C. a new government, not the territorial one it had before, but a commission appointed by the president. During that same period, famed abolitionist Frederick Douglass made the city his home, living there for nearly 2 decades, where he served as the D.C. Marshal and later Consul to Haiti, the first time the Senate ever confirmed a black presidential appointee. The biggest change to the city's layout since the L'Enfant Plan came in the early 1900s with the McMillan Plan. Spearheaded by Michigan Senator James McMillan, it finished many unrealized parts of the L'Enfant Plan as well as added new elements, and largely gave D.C. the layout it has today, revitalizing the area around the National Mall with museums, new federal office buildings, beautiful reflecting pools, and monuments like the Lincoln Memorial. During the Great Depression, a violent incident occurred in which tens of thousands of poor World War I veterans and their families, devastated by the Depression, came into the city to ask for their veterans bonuses, setting up huge encampments. President Hoover forced them out, using the U.S. Army to violently clear the so-called bonus army of protesting veterans out of the city. D.C. had always had a large and often prosperous black population, but segregation and at times mob violence from white supremacists attempted to keep black Washingtonians down. As both a city with a large black population and the home of the federal government, it played an essential role in the civil rights movement, and was where leaders like Martin Luther King would meet with presidents and politicians to advance civil rights legislation, as well as hold massive protests, most famously in 1963, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where King stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, overlooking a crowd of 250,000 people, and gave his famed "I Have a Dream" speech. D.C. was the first city in the country to desegregate its schools, doing so in 1954. After King's assassination, the country was rocked by riots, some of the largest occurred in D.C. During the 20th century, D.C.'s black population, which had already been quite significant at around 31% of the population in 1900, skyrocketed. During the World Wars, many people left to go serve overseas, and in addition to a need to fill those jobs, many new ones were created as the country ramped up military production. Many black Americans left exploitive sharecropping jobs in the rural South to seek these new opportunities in northern cities, in a massive multi-decade wave of movement called the Great Migration. Connected to the South by rail and home to ample job opportunities as well as a large established black community, Washington was a major destination during the Great Migration. At the same time, in a trend that was occurring across the country, many white people left the city to the fast-expanding suburbs. This was a combination of a racist reaction to racial integration and the growing black population of northern cities, as well as an economic consequence of a racist practice called redlining, in which neighborhoods were financially devalued and values of homes lowered if they had large black populations. On top of that, many black people were refused credit, insurance, loans, mortgages, and other services that had helped many poor white people rise into the middle class. These practices brought many black neighborhoods into poverty, and while white people fled to the suburbs, many black people, due to the economic consequences of redlining, often could not afford to move to the suburbs or were simply refused when trying to buy homes there. This combination of the Great Migration and white flight was particularly prevalent in D.C., which saw its suburbs begin to sprawl through Maryland and Virginia as it became the first majority black major city in the U.S. Black people went from making up 28% of Washington's population in 1940 to 71% just 3 decades later, and having a major influence on the history, society, and culture of the district, which would affectionately be nicknamed Chocolate City. In 1967, President Lyndon Johnson changed the district's government again, got rid of the 3-member commission which had governed the city, instead appointing an executive called the Mayor Commissioner and a district council. This plan would only last 8 years before the Home Rule Act allowed Washingtonians to elect their mayor and district council themselves. In their first Home Rule elections, the city elected Walter Washington, who had been their mayor commissioner under Johnson, to be the city's first mayor. He became the first black mayor of D.C. or any major U.S. city, and every mayor of D.C. since has also been black. In 1954, 4 gunmen who wanted Puerto Rico to become independent from the U.S. entered the Capitol and began firing at House members, though luckily none were killed. In 1972, the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate, a large hotel and office complex along the Potomac, was broken into on the orders of members of President Richard Nixon's administration, something Nixon himself later tried to cover up. It opened the door to the uncovering of significant corruption within the administration, which would lead to Nixon's resignation, the first and only time as of now a U.S. president has resigned. In 1976, the D.C. Metro, the city's subway system, opened, which would connect and ease transportation in much of the district as well as its suburbs in Maryland and Virginia. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan survived being shot in an attempted assassination at the Washington Hilton. The city, likely the Capitol or the White House, was one of the targets of terrorists during the 9/11 attacks in 2001. However, heroic passengers on board revolted, taking the plane down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and sacrificing their lives to prevent an attack on the capital city. The Pentagon, which was attacked on the day as well, sat just across the river in Arlington, Virginia. Just a year later, the D.C. snipers terrorized the city, killing 10 people in D.C. and its suburbs over the course of a month before being caught. In January of 2021, a violent mob breached and stormed the Capitol in an attempt to disrupt and overturn the Electoral College certification that was underway, and several people died. A couple months later, the House of Representatives passed the Washington, D.C. Admission Act, which was not taken up by the Senate, but if passed by both houses of Congress and signed into law by the President, would have seen D.C. admitted as the 51st state, called the Douglas Commonwealth after Frederick Douglass, which would still abbreviate to D.C. The area around the mall where most government buildings are would remain under the federal district, but the rest of D.C., which is mostly residential, would become part of the 51st state. Though it did not even make it to the Senate, it's still the closest the country has ever come to admitting a 51st state, and the movement for D.C.'s statehood isn't likely to go anywhere. It's alluded to on district license plates, which read "no taxation without representation." Statehood is overwhelmingly popular within the district. In 2016, they held a referendum on statehood, which passed with 86% voting for becoming the 51st state. However, among politicians, it's mostly become a party line issue. D.C. overwhelmingly supports the Democratic Party, and many Republican politicians oppose statehood because it would add a new voting House member and 2 new senators, all 3 of whom would likely be Democrats. Some people have suggested retroceding the district back to Maryland, so they would be able to vote without changing the makeup of the Senate, but this proposal is strongly opposed by both Maryland and DC's population. The statehood movement is about both congressional representation and self-government, and it's unlikely that Washingtonians would want to leave control of Congress just to be under the jurisdiction of another state. Besides, DC has been separated from Maryland longer than most other states have even existed. It has its own distinct culture, society, and history. If you apply this to other states with small populations rejoining states they were once part of, such a proposal would be unthinkable as well. The people of Maine would never support rejoining Massachusetts, West Virginians wouldn't want to become part of Virginia again, and the Dakotas would never want to reunify, and so on. There are almost 2 different sides to Washington, D.C. There's the capital of the United States, with its beautiful towering monuments, grand architecture, the halls of government where important decisions are made, and history is everywhere. The few square miles that encompass the Capitol, White House, and all the government agencies is potentially the most important and influential stretch of land on Earth. Then there's Washington, D.C., the city, the place tourists usually don't venture off into, a city of hundreds of thousands of people living in townhouses and apartments all throughout the city's many different and distinct neighborhoods, many of whom don't work in government jobs. This is the city that was the birthplace of go-go music, mambo sauce, and half smokes, a classic D.C. sausage sandwich. U Street is arguably the center of D.C.'s black community and is home to Ben's Chili Bowl, a city landmark known for its half smokes. D.C. has simply too many landmarks to name. It is a city of monuments and museums and memorials, so I'm certainly going to miss many of them. To name a few though, it's home to the White House, the Capitol, and the Supreme Court, the headquarters of all three branches of the federal government. It's where presidents are inaugurated, and it's been home to too many major protests to count. The Library of Congress sits by the Capitol and Supreme Court on Capitol Hill, and it's home to most of the major government agencies and departments, such as the Treasury and State Department, and so on. The National Archives contain the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and Bill of Rights, and the National Portrait Gallery has all the presidential portraits. It's filled with great museums, and the best part being that almost all of them are free. The Smithsonian Institution, headquartered in the beautiful Smithsonian Castle, manages many incredible museums along the National Mall and in other parts of the city, including the Museum of Natural History, Air and Space, American History, African American History and Culture, and the National Zoo, just to name a few. Other museums, such as the Holocaust Museum, Ford's Theater, and the International Spy Museum, are all worth a visit as well. The city's monuments and memorials are breathtaking, such as the Lincoln Memorial, Washington Monument, Vietnam War Memorial, MLK Memorial, FDR Memorial, Jefferson Memorial, and so on. The Tidal Basin, where many of them are located, is surrounded by beautiful pink cherry blossoms, and Washington's home to a cherry blossom festival that brings many people into the city in the spring. Everyone knows about the big memorials, but throughout the city you can stumble upon a small memorial or statue pretty much wherever you go. The area around DuPont Circle and Massachusetts Avenue is nicknamed Embassy Row, as it's lined with embassies and diplomatic posts from many of the more than 175 different countries that have their embassies in D.C., many of which are built in traditional architectural styles from their respective countries. The Kennedy Center is a beautiful performance venue on the Potomac. The National Cathedral is a stunning hilltop cathedral that's the second largest church building in the country. The third largest, the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, is in D.C. as well. The National Arboretum is a huge green space along the Anacostia. Georgetown remains a distinct and historic neighborhood, and a walk through it will take you back to a city that existed before D.C. was created. Union Station is a spectacular transit hub and shopping center. In addition, the DC Metro is, in my opinion, the best and easiest public transit system I've used in the US, and is often very deep beneath the city, with long escalators taking you down to the tunnels below. The city is laid out in a grid with 4 quadrants, the northwest, northeast, southwest, and southeast, that all meet at the Capitol. The roads then move in a grid shape out from the Capitol. With some quirks and exceptions, the horizontal streets on either side of the Capitol are A Street, followed by B Street, C, D, E, and so on, with letters increasing the further you get from the Capitol. Vertically, the streets are numbered in the same fashion, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Because of this, the city has 2 streets of each number and letter, but they are marked with the quadrants so you can tell which is which. In addition, it's crisscrossed with diagonally running streets, usually named after states, such as Pennsylvania Avenue, which the White House and Capitol both sit on. Often, a number of these diagonal streets will meet at the same spot, along with vertical and horizontal ones. Usually, instead of making an incredibly dangerous intersection, though those do exist, they meet in a circle. These circles, such as DuPont Circle, Thomas Circle, Logan Circle, Washington Circle, and so on, usually have parks and monuments inside, and develop distinct neighborhoods around them. Having the diagonal streets allows you to get between locations faster, and the numbering system, once you get the hang of it, makes the city very easy to navigate and know where you are as well as how far you are away from other places. There's also a major income divide in the city. The area around and beyond Rock Creek Park is wealthy and affluent, as is the neighborhood of Capitol Hill. If they don't live outside in Maryland and Virginia, these are where the politicians, appointees, and lobbyists, there are many, many lobbyists, live, and it creates a massive income disparity between them and the rest of DC, which is very working class. In fact, DC has some of the worst income inequality in the entire country. Only Puerto Rico and New York are worse. One of the most unique parts about DC is its height limit, one of the elements of its European layout. Although there are some buildings like the old post office that surpass it, for the most part, buildings' roof lines above the street can't be taller than 130 feet. This means that DC's downtown is hardly noticeable or distinguishable from many of its other neighborhoods, and it's also part of the reason the city is so expensive and the suburbs so expansive. But it also gives DC a unique look, feel, and layout that you can't find anywhere else in the US, and allows the Capitol and Washington Monument to be visible throughout much of the city. Because of this, Roslyn, a neighborhood in Arlington across the river from Georgetown, almost looks like it should be DC's downtown, because its buildings are so much taller than most in the district. Washington is incredibly diverse, home to many different racial and ethnic groups. Black people make up the largest racial group in the city at 41% of DC's population, a higher proportion than any US state or territory besides the Virgin Islands. White people make up 38% of Washington's population, Latinos 11%, and Asian Americans 5%. It's home to a number of major immigrant groups as well. The most prominent are Ethiopians and Salvadorans. DC is home to more Ethiopians than anywhere else in the world outside Africa, and many immigrants from the Caribbean, Asia, and Europe live throughout the district and its suburbs. DC is currently experiencing a reversal of the demographic shifts that occurred in the middle of last century. Wealthier, often white government employees are moving back into the district. Poorer and middle-class neighborhoods, many of them predominantly black, are being torn down and renovated in a process called gentrification to build newer apartments for all the people moving into the city. This renewal of poorer neighborhoods would be less of a problem if it didn't drastically change the housing costs of living there. These rising costs are pricing many Washingtonians out of neighborhoods they and their families have called home for generations, preventing people from being able to afford to live in their own city. It's happening in many black neighborhoods in DC, and as a result, many black Washingtonians are being pushed into the suburbs in neighboring Prince George's County, Maryland, while many white people move in. For example, in 1980, 70% of DC's population was black. That number is now down to the 40s. Religiously, DC is 72% Christian, mostly Protestant. Nearly 8% of the district is Jewish, which gives it the second highest proportion of Jewish residents of any part of the US after only New York. 2% of Washingtonians are Muslim, and the city is home to the Islamic Center of Washington, the largest mosque in the entire Western Hemisphere. The Washington Post is one of the largest newspapers in circulation and is read not just in DC but around the country. NPR is headquartered in the city, as are major publications like National Geographic and Foreign Policy. It's home to a number of major colleges and universities such as Georgetown, George Washington, and American University, all well-known institutions. Howard University is one of the most renowned historically black colleges and universities in the country, and Gallaudet University is the largest school for the deaf and hard of hearing in the world. It's also home to the National Defense University, a military and national security college, and other schools such as the Catholic University of America, the University of the District of Columbia, and so on. Washington is home to Major League Baseball, football, hockey, basketball, and soccer. The MLB's Washington Nationals play at Nationals Park on the Anacostia River, DC United not far away at Audi Field. The NHL's Washington Capitals and NBA's Washington Wizards play at the Capital One Arena right in the heart of the city, and the NFL's Washington Commanders play at FedEx Field 2.5 miles outside the district in Maryland, but represent DC. 3 major airports serve the DC area. Dulles in Virginia is the city's international airport. Reagan, just across the river in Arlington, is its national airport, and Baltimore Washington International sits in Maryland between it and nearby Baltimore, and serves both cities. The government is the largest employer in the district, employing 25% of its residents in some fashion, but it's filled with other high-paying government-related jobs in it and nearby, such as defense contractors, lobbying firms, and international organizations like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, both of which have their headquarters there. I won't even get started on Maryland and Virginia, the suburbs in which are filled with major corporate headquarters that simply couldn't fit in the district. Because of this, the tiny district has a higher GDP than 17 different states, and by far the highest GDP per capita in the entire country, more than twice that of the second place on the list, New York. No presidents were from DC. Politicians typically consider it a point of pride to be from outside the city so they can run on bringing change to Washington, which is typically portrayed in American politics as elitist and out of touch with the rest of the country. Of course, there's elements of truth to that. The city is filled with plenty of self-serving people, but most of DC is a normal city filled with normal people who don't work in government, and if they do, are often just there to make a difference, serving in minor bureaucratic positions that keep the gears of the country turning. Yet, the city gets constantly lambasted as a way for individual politicians to advance their own political careers. Despite this, of course, every president since John Adams has lived in Washington during their presidency, and some, such as Barack Obama, have stayed in the city after. Many famous people are or from or were born in DC, such as Bill Nye, Kevin Durant, Dave Chappelle, Duke Ellington, Marvin Gaye, Al Gore, and J. Edgar Hoover. Politically, the District of Columbia is the bluest part of the U.S. that casts electoral votes in presidential elections. It has a Cook Partisan Voting Index of D plus 43, which means that in a given election year, Democrats do 43% better in D.C. than they do in the country on average. In fact, D.C. has voted for the Democratic Party in every presidential election since they were able to vote in 1964, and on average, they have a 74% margin of victory over Republicans in the district. D.C.'s Mayor, Muriel Bowser, and House Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton are both Democrats. That is it for the District of Columbia. I want to give a big thank you to everyone who has already joined my Patreon. Through it, you can access different things such as behind-the-scenes videos, early access to maps I create, an exclusive Discord Q&A with me, ad-free content, and shoutouts in my videos like these. Please be sure to check out the TII store, where you'll be able to purchase all sorts of official That Is Interesting products and merchandise, including shirts, hoodies, embroidered beanies, masks, mugs, embroidered backpacks, laptop stickers and sleeves, and so on. One of the products I'm most excited about are these limited edition framed prints that commemorate each video in the US Explained. These are available as soon as the corresponding US Explained video is uploaded, but only 10 of each will be released, so please make sure to buy one before they go out of stock. Right now, you'll be able to buy a DC print, so please click the link in the description and go pay a visit to the TII store. Also, please subscribe to my brother's channel, Quinn the Cameraman. He made the great intro at the beginning of this video that I'll use in all the US Explained videos, so go show him some support. I tried to be pretty thorough with this video, but I know there were definitely things I missed as there was a lot to talk about. I want to give a big thank you to everyone from Washington, D.C. who helped give me information for this video, leaving detailed and informative comments on YouTube as well as Discord. I truly would not have been able to make this video without all your help. My next video in the series will be on Vermont. I've never been to Vermont, so I'll need all the help I can get. If you're from Vermont, please respond to my community post or my comment here, or leave something in the Discord server to let me know what you'd like to see included about your home state. I really appreciate the well over 600 of you who have already joined my Discord server. If you haven't joined the Discord yet, it's a great place to continue conversations about topics discussed in these videos, interact with fellow viewers, and help provide information about upcoming states in this series. It's a great community, and we do fun stuff like geography game nights, live podcasts, and so on. I'll put links to both the Patreon and the Discord in the comments. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you learned something new. Subscribe for more content like this. I cover the countries, cities, people, and places of the world and beyond. These videos will leave you saying, that is interesting.